Hi, this is Deep Noetics, and today we are going to be speaking about the Eurasian heartland, or the mainland of planet Earth. Whenever we read history, we tend to read the history of the Roman Empire, history that is potentially more Europe focused. However, the Eurasian landmass is the actual heavy point of population. It is actually where most of the planet live and have lived throughout all of our history. So in those days, the heart really of planet Earth, the heartland of the world was Central Eurasia. And today we're going to be speaking about this, looking at my article on Substack, titled Eruptions from the Heartland: How the Eurasian Steppe has consistently derailed world history and still does today. The collapse of the medieval system that had governed Western Europe was accompanied by a general disintegration of all major Eurasian empires. It was in the 13th and 14th centuries where the foremost civilizations of the continent all found their demise. The Abbasid Caliphate, the Chinese Sung, and the Kievan Rus are only a few examples of cultures at opposite ends of the world's largest landmass, all of them destroyed within less than a century. This was neither accomplished by a more advanced society wielding sophisticated tech, nor was it accomplished by a group with a particularly strong unified religion. We are speaking of steppe horseback riders raiding cities, destroying monuments, and establishing a reign of violence and annihilation across the continent. People have reported that it was possible to smell the horde days in advance of their arrival. Arguably, the eruption of invaders from the heartland was not an isolated event, but can be regarded as a regularly occurring movement of peoples outward from the interior of Eurasia. Roughly every 1,000 years, we can find accounts of peoples migrating towards the outer rim of the continent, likely pushed outwards from the center. Here in the picture, you can see the heartland of Eurasia right here, then the rimland as described by Spickman, and the New World. So essentially, we have this one landmass that is connected with two peninsulas. One is Africa, that is you could say, somewhat separate peninsula, and then you have Europe, which is a sort of connected peninsula. Then you have the Rimland, and then outside of it, you got the New World, which has become the new imperial center. So the imperial center, for the first time in history, has kind of shifted fundamentally away from the Eurasian axis. In antiquity, classical antiquity was determined by an imperial center in the Mediterranean, the famous Roman Empire. At the same time, there was a separate imperial center on a separate territory in the east in China, the so-called Han Dynasty. The first people to think about really the geographical implications of the landmass, land structure, the geometry of the world, you could say, and the climate on political developments, on historical developments, the first one to talk about this was Ibn Khaldun with his work called the Muqaddimah, the study of the beginnings. You could say it's a historical work, but it was also the first sociological, socio-historical, a work that at the same time came with a theory about the patterns and cycles of history. He considered the North in general, the Northern Hemisphere, pointing in a way here at the heartland from where he lived in Northern Africa, as those that are kind of the counterweight, the counterpart to the desert of the Sahara, the desert of Africa. Towards the equator, you have the heat, you have the desert, the heat of the desert, the you could say scarcity and poverty of the land due to its temperature conditions. And you got the counterpart for the coldness of the north at the polar region going further up. And in between lied the Mediterranean. And in between was for him kind of the temperate zones, those that are in between that are capable of sustaining a larger empire, larger populations. And so the imperial developments, as they always play out between inside and outside at the threshold border region, Peter Turchin would refer to it as a meta-ethnic frontier. They happen at those regions. The meta-ethnic frontiers become hotbeds and often breeding grounds for new imperial centers. But there's this idea that there was a kind of hidden and unknown imperial center, a center that was that had accomplished to be in a sense imperial, but at the same time without a center, without a common logical or structural unity. And that is represented by the Mongols, that is represented by the Huns, by the various Huns, the various Hun empires that formed throughout Eurasia, the various riders, horseback riders coming from the steppe of the heartland. The steppe here being kind of the other part of the puzzle. You have the desert and you have the polar desert, the frozen, the cold, the icy desert. And then you've got the steppe, which is just the plain. It is just the flat land that does not sustain agriculture, but it can sustain herds of animals. And animals that can move pretty long distances because of the terrain, because the terrain is flat and walkable and stable. This also enables the quick and swift migrations of horseback riders, of people sitting on the horses on and kind of becoming part of the herd. The herd is kind of merged into the idea of the horde. The horde is the herd. It's the horde of people on horsebacks being supported by the steppe. And this is a warrior like culture. It is a shamanistic culture. Shamanistic in the sense that it is superstitious. It has a multitude of spirits and ghosts and a kind of you could say incoherent or pre-coherent ideological structure. It is not in a sense formed to be consistent, but only to kind of enable a common group spirit, something that Ibn Khaldun referred to as the asabiya, asab being Arabic for the nerve of a people. So there was a center that managed in the 13th century, throughout the 13th century, to destroy all major civilizations on the planet. Or not all of them, but like the majority and the biggest ones. The Abbasid Caliphate that had ruled from Baghdad, the most populous, most the city, the largest city with the most inhabitants through most of the Middle Ages. Baghdad was an imperial center for the Abbasid Caliphate, for a vastly huge empire. It had declined through the influx of horseback riders from the interior of the Eurasian continent. First being raided and invaded by Turkic groups such as the Seljuks, or before that the Scythians or the Sumerians. you have the Mongols essentially, after a first weaker wave of the Xiongnu or the Huns, you get a millennium later the Mongols, 1,000 years later in the next cycle, the Mongols, and they just sweep through Asia, and many of the largest civilizations collapse. Most notably, Attila the Hun in the 5th century AD was a commander of a central Eurasian force that had settled in Europe in the preceding centuries. This same group, known in China as the Xiongnu, had also been invading the remnants of the weakened Han dynasty in China. In this sense, the Mongol invasions of the 13th century can be seen as a repetition of the previous millennium. Due to the lack of documentary evidence and the steppe people's rather nomadic and pastoral lifestyle, it is generally difficult to find concrete details regarding the specific characteristics of their cultures and systems of government. Even the differences between ethnic groups living in the steppe remain blurry to the extent that we are only allowed a glimpse at the steppe population under the general umbrella term of Turkic Mongol people. Moreover, before the development of horseback warfare in the early Iron Age, it is unclear whether the earlier migrations of the 2nd millennium BC even lead to any direct incursions of steppe warriors to the Outer Rim regions. The few accounts we know of may actually deal with non-steppe ethnic groups that were pushed from the Inner Rim to the Outer Rim. The earliest we know of are the post-Iron Age Cimmerians and Scythians. The mystery attached to steppe cultures and their persistent influence on world events bestows upon them the characteristics of a force of nature or blind animalistic instinct of a continent. This is known as Eurasianism. Alexander Dugin is probably the most famous proponent of a kind of Eurasianism that opposes the Atlanticism of the West. In other words, what used to be a sea-based empire under the Romans, the Mediterranean-based empire under the Romans, that was the imperial center of the Eurasian heartland, it has transformed now to a new sea, a much larger sea, and that is the Atlantic Ocean, which connects the American continent, or you could say the coastal elites of the east coast of the United States, with the elites on the west coast of Eurasia, which is members of especially countries like Britain, but also in many ways France, Germany, and the European Union as a whole. The mystery attached to steppe cultures and their persistent influence on world events bestows upon them the characteristics of a force of nature or blind animalistic instinct of a continent. The Hephthalites, also known as the White Huns, represent one of many such strange groups about which little is known. Steppe warriors appear as a destructive avalanche, annihilating anything that crosses their path, yet once they settled and adopted the customs of civilization and empire, we find their reigns ending rather swiftly. Only those Mongol descendant empires prevailed that accomplished a productive synthesis with another, more sophisticated culture could prevail. So the dialectic of empire is a constant merger. You could say a Hegelian master-slave dialectic, a constant merger between the inside and the outside of the empire. The entropic force, the development of kind of the overall necessary development of what causality imposes on us, you could say, is this perpetual movement, something that is the rise but at once the decay of an empire. Alexander Dugin was influenced by the occultist Aleister Crowley. So Dugin has a kind of spiritual, you could say almost a daemonic, Daemon, daemonic, where he believes in kind of alternative quasi-material entities, spirits that can be invoked through certain ritual practices. Eurasia is in a sense a living entity. It is a goddess, a Lovecraftian monster in a way that is threatening to awaken, to fend off the Atlanticist empire, which is Western civilization. The Mongol Empire reshaped the face of Eurasia, and every emerging empire afterwards bore the stamp of its legacy. Even before and after the Mongols, each major empire in Eurasia was constantly occupied with the fending off of invasions coming from the center. Understanding this, we gain a deeper insight into what profound impact wild Central Eurasia had on the entire setup of its peripheral civilizations. Whilst the Chinese were mostly successful in walling themselves off, Persia is a region in which power was regularly usurped by invading forces from the center. Tamerlane, the brutal Chagatai military commander, ruled over the largest territorial empire in the world at the end of the 14th century. His Khanate was to serve as the foundation upon which the Safavids and Mughals were later to erect their empires. The Mughal Empire was especially unique in its size and centralization, effectively becoming the largest economy in the world until its subjugation by the British during the middle of the 18th century. On a geopolitical level, the secondary effects of the Mongol conquests was enormous. Whilst Western Europe was not directly invaded, many of their Muslim foes were destroyed in the course of sweeping Mongol victories over them. Moreover, two major developments have left a profound and lasting impact on the subsequent evolution of world history. On the one hand, the novel interconnectedness of the Eurasian continent, connecting the golden hordes of Russia to the distant Chinese, facilitated, in addition to the greatest expeditions of Marco Polo, the transmission of the bubonic plague into Europe. This means that even the final death blow to the European feudal system can be indirectly attributed to the Mongols. Secondly, the direct threat that the Mongols continuously posed to the Chinese induced the Ming dynasty to deem the reinforcement and security of their western frontier more important than the expansion of their naval fleet. This effectively left the playing field of naval expansion open for the Portuguese to conquer and dominate. Despite the fact that Mughal and Chinese rulers showed little interest in European goods and merchants, the great naval game would later set the stage for the European conquest of the entire globe. The cultural impact of the Mongols can be found in the legacy which the Timurids, the Empire of Tamerlane, left behind in terms of the cultural legitimization of titles bestowed upon by the rulers of the heartland. Arguably, the Mughal Empire would have survived the British, French, and Dutch incursions if they had been able to play off one imperial contestant against the other during the 7-Year War in 1756. However, they were burdened by invasions in the tradition of Tamerlane coming from the northwestern Khorasan region, modern Afghanistan. The Persian Qajar conqueror Nadir Shah and his top general Ahmad Shah Durrani began invading Mughal India in 1739, essentially weakening their realm sufficiently to facilitate the subsequent British conquest of the entire region. India would evolve to become the heartland of the British Empire. the same role Mexico or some South American colonies had played for the Spanish. The rise of industrial production in Europe was made possible by the British Indian trade of raw materials and manufactured goods. Here we have Ahmad Shah Durrani. He was the first founder of a Pashtun dynasty of kings that ruled what is modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, and parts of India. He was a Pashtun, a group that still lives in the mountains of the Hindu Kush, that lives on both sides of the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. It is the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan and largely represented in the Taliban, for example. Whilst America and South Africa required the establishment of a new modern infrastructure, importing slave labor from other regions with the adoption of India as a colonial prize, the British had gained an already existing power structure previously established by the Mughals. China, being another already established high culture and power center, also became part of the British colonial trade system, albeit heavily reliant on Britain's Indian base. The fate of Afghanistan, a land which first came onto the global stage after having been emancipated from the Qajars by Ahmad Shah Durrani in 1747, which was the establishment of the Pashtun Empire, where Ahmad Shah Durrani was a general, kind of carved out his own empire within the Qajar Empire. The Qajars ruled in Persia until colonial invasion placed the Pahlavi family onto its imperial position, which was overthrown in the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which is the regime still currently ruling in Iran. The assembly of the first United Grand Tribal Council, Loya Jirga, brought together a regional buffer empire, a country that, despite its lack of central unity, managed to fend off every foreign occupation until this day. Firstly, it should be noted that even among Pashtun tribal leaders, the legacy of Tamerlane had prevailed, as Ahmad Shah chose to name his son Timur Shah after the great conqueror. Moreover, the defeat of the Mughals fundamentally turned the tides on the hitherto prevailing dynamic of Eurasian heartland politics. From then on, it was no longer the heartland erupting outwards onto the outer rims, but in fact a great invasion of the outer rim empires inwards towards the center. The invasion of the heartland from the outside was known as the Great Game, the competition for Asia between the Russian and British imperial forces. Though Russia was territorial Eurasian, politically it should be regarded as a European power. Historically, its conquests have seen and forward the basis of its territorial expansion initially outwardly from its center in Kiev, and then later from Moscow. After the Mongol yoke was removed, Russia became increasingly Western-oriented, their orientation being best embodied by the Romanovs, who bore a special obsession with German, English, and French culture. Thus, the colonial age represented a great inversion of the dynamic of Eurasian heartland politics. This inversion was carefully observed by Halford Mackinder, the originator of modern geopolitical theory. He warned the strategists of the British Empire that a Russian domination of the heartland would be perilous to the British paradigm of world dominance and would thus necessitate a careful strategic incursions into the continent. Three major wars against the Afghan rulers ended in failure, and the heartland proved to be a tough and intractable terrain to occupy and manage. Afghanistan represents a geostrategic region of supreme importance due to its mountainous border region separating the Eurasian flatlands from the Indian subcontinent. Much of Britain's policy was focused on not only expanding its influence into Asia, specifically around India and China, but also on the suppression of German nationalism, a force that could lead to a combining of German naval power with Russian heartland power. This never changed. The United States, now leading the world as the post-colonial hegemon, appears to be pursuing a similar Eurasian policy of containment. Its major rivals, first the Soviet Union, now Russia, and China, appear to be the target of belligerent US foreign policy. Though the frontiers of Western influence have been consistently encroaching upon the heartland, see the opening up of Chinese markets, the alliance with Taiwan, or the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe, there are nevertheless serious worries concerning their Eurasian rivals as expressed by US strategists. Here we see a picture of the Taliban takeover of the day where they stormed Kabul and took over the presidential residency and presidential palace. Just as the innovation of horseback warfare allowed for steppe warrior invasions to become infinitely more lethal, the rise of rail transport could allow for trade and commerce to match the velocity of naval trade. This way, major Eurasian powers could coordinate a railway-based trade network that effectively constituted an integrated economic body linked to the majority of world resources. Afghanistan could have been a crucial beachhead for the Americans into the Eurasian heartland, but alas, it remains to be seen which way history will take us. Thank you for listening. This has been Eruptions from the Heartland, my article on my Substack from my Substack page Notes from the Archive, and I will see you in the next video.